reporter in England once asked Gandhi what he thought of Western civilization. Gandhi replied, "I think it would be a good idea." Candid, to say the least. Gandhi is known around the world as one of the greatest leaders in history. He led India to independence in 1947. Yet he was also a complicated figure, and his place in the story of India under colonialism is indispensable for really understanding how India achieved freedom. In this lecture, we'll examine Gandhi's sophisticated, if somewhat contradictory, nationalist philosophy and political program, and how he critiqued the Raj to a degree unlike any of his nationalist predecessors. We'll take a look at Gandhi's background and upbringing, and his story before he became a leader of nationalism. Then we'll examine his moral and political philosophy. We'll see that for Gandhi, unlike the British, morals and politics were ultimately one and the same. After that, we're going to examine the forces of modernity that Gandhi critiqued and how they influenced his philosophy. And lastly, we're going to examine a particular event in India in 1919, which served to catapult him onto the national stage, where he started confronting the British like never before. By the end of this lecture, we'll better understand how it is that a minor English-educated barrister from Gujarat ended up leading a movement which would eventually bring down the British Empire. Because this is a course on the history of British India, the significance of Gandhi is more than obvious. Gandhi, remember, led and organized a movement which was the first and most successful resistance to colonial imperialism in the whole world. India was the first non-white settler colony to gain independence, and after that, the sun indeed did set on the British Empire. So let's start with an overview of Gandhi's background and upbringing. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born in 1869 into a Western Indian family in Porbandar, Gujarat. He came from a banya, or trading merchant background, specifically grocers. That is what the name Gandhi actually means. But his family had a history of service to the courts of minor and lesser Indian princes in Western India. Gandhi had an arranged marriage at the age of 13 to Kasturbai Makhanji, and 5 years later, they gave birth to their first son, Harilal. That same year, Gandhi left for Britain to study law in London. Now, Gandhi's time in London was very interesting. He was shy and tongue-tied. No one in their wildest imagination would have imagined that this sheepish individual would help bring down the British Empire. He saw aspects of London society that belied the image of British superiority: the pub-fueled nights in the East End, informal networks of prostitution, and, more generally, the English working classes. And surprisingly, perhaps unsurprisingly, Gandhi found English food unpalatably bland and crude. He became a committee member of the London Vegetarian Society, which still exists to this day. Yet Gandhi's experience in London was both an emotional and social ordeal. He felt estranged from the gentlemanly lifestyle that was associated with pinstriped type-wearing lads. Emotionally, he couldn't connect with London society. So he abandoned his attempts to be a dandy Victorian gentleman and started to live a frugal, removed, and more quiet lifestyle. The next 2 years, Gandhi threw himself into his work, studying for the bar. Here, we see a foretaste of his hectic and almost militant work schedules after 1920. In 1891, he passed the bar from the famous Inner Temple, part of the Inns of Court in London. With his education complete, Gandhi had achieved what Macaulay would have wanted. He was a well-educated, anglicized Indian gentleman. Gandhi then returned to India for a few years as a barrister, attempting to practice law in Bombay. But Gandhi was too tongue-tied to speak during his first case, and he had to compete with a glut of other Indian lawyers. Humiliated and depressed, Gandhi decided to try his luck in South Africa, and he set sail in 1893. He took odd work with an Indian Muslim trading firm and also got a year's contract with an Indian law firm, and he eventually set up his very own law firm. But it was in South Africa that Gandhi started his experiments with peaceful resistance and nonviolence. These initial forays were crucial into fashioning him into a potential national leader. He founded the Natal Indian Congress and petitioned against anti-Indian racial discrimination laws in South Africa. Famously, he was literally tossed out of a railway carriage outside of Pietermaritzburg, when the white train conductor insisted that, even though Gandhi had purchased a first-class ticket, no colored people were allowed in first class. After this humiliating episode, Gandhi in 1903 settled in Johannesburg to start work on a newsletter called Indian Opinion. He started to utilize the resources available in colonial society, newspapers and associations, in order to publicize political issues and to voice Indian discontent, and to generally rally them. He also continued to petition against anti-Indian racial discrimination. You can probably guess what it was like for non-Europeans living in South Africa back then. It wasn't apartheid. That would come later. But it was still rough discrimination. British South Africa legalized discrimination against non-European peoples, Indians, and Black Africans. They all needed to carry identity papers with them at all times, but Europeans didn't have to carry them. To Gandhi, this smacked of racism. So in 1906, he moved the famous Resolution 4 at a meeting of Indians in South Africa and called for civil disobedience against this legislation. 2 years later, he led a famous mass burning of registration certificates in Johannesburg. Gandhi was then twice imprisoned, once in January and again in October 1908. His terms were light, and he was released. But most importantly, he formally adopted the term satyagraha and made it part of his moral and political vocabulary. And on a boat return from London to petition for Indian rights in the United Kingdom, Gandhi composed his famous treatise, Hind Swaraj. And he remained in South Africa until he returned to wartime India in 1915. When Gandhi returned to India, he was sort of an outsider in the Congress party. He didn't wear Western clothes like the other Congress leaders. Remember, most Congress party members were elites. They were comfortable in bungalows with lots of servants and existing networks of patronage. They weren't interested in popular causes anyway. Even the first nationalist critic of the Raj, Dadabhai Naoroji, spent most of his time in England and never really visited the poor rural districts which he implied had been greatly affected by the drain of wealth from India. But Gandhi was different. He decided to travel around the country by train to see the real India. And he was profoundly influenced by the poverty he saw. He saw villagers scraping to get by when the monsoon rains never arrived, but the tax demands remained. He saw farmers forced to grow indigo, which left less food for people to eat. He saw how those who did grow indigo sometimes were at the mercy of the global marketplace, harvesting truckfuls only to find that the price had dropped and having to absorb the losses and pay their farmers less. When Gandhi said poverty is the worst form of violence, he spoke from his own experience. To Gandhi, the free market was violent even if the players didn't use swords. But Gandhi was not yet a political extremist. He saw promise in the British Empire, at least initially. He argued that the British Empire could offer equal liberty to all, regardless of color or religion. So Gandhi sought to reform governance of the empire from within and not challenge its constitutional foundations. During the South African War between 1899 and 1902, Gandhi organized an ambulance corps for the British Army. In 1906, during the Zulu Rebellion in South Africa, he did the same thing. And even as late as 1918 in India, he was actively recruiting Indian men to fight for the British Indian Army in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Perhaps the great irony was that Gandhi championed the universal rights and liberties of the British Empire and the Enlightenment more than most Europeans. Now, let's talk about the influences upon Gandhi and the development of his character and worldview. Gandhi was greatly influenced by his cosmopolitan background and career. He was the perfect example of the 20th century globalized individual. He lived on 3 continents, spoke at least 3 languages, and was very much a man of the world. He was well-read, conversant, and engaging, and could talk about the Bhagavad Gita, the Communist Manifesto, and Voltaire. Thus, Gandhi was brought up in a world full of different peoples and ideas. Gandhi was also influenced by missionary Christianity. Remember, Protestant missions spread out across the world with the expansion of the British Empire. And Gandhi became friends with one Anglican missionary named Charlie Andrews. Close friends until his death in Calcutta in 1940. Andrews was the only person whom Gandhi allowed to call him Mohan. Gandhi read the stories of Jesus as if they were no different from his understanding of Prince Arjuna being counseled by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Yet, curiously, Gandhi pointed out the contradictions inherent between the relationship between missionary Christianity and the British Empire. Though many observers at the time thought the British Empire was divinely ordained to spread the gospel, Gandhi offered one of the most cutting critiques of this idea. The British and the West were powerful not because of Christianity, he said, but in spite of it. He noted that European Christians rarely practiced what they preached. Gandhi was probably the greatest Christian who never converted. Now, Gandhi was certainly one of the most admirable moralists of the modern era. In a way, he was a saint, but we shouldn't forget that he was also one of the most shrewd politicians ever to grace God's green earth. You see, Gandhi did not separate politics from morality. The British in India clearly did. But to Gandhi, morality and politics were one and the same. And while he wasn't a theocrat, his success lay in forcibly showing the British and the world that politics and morality have to be addressed together and cannot be separated. Now, let's go to exploring these political tools Gandhi developed. The first tool that Gandhi developed was called ahimsa. Originally an ancient Jain concept, it really translates not as nonviolence, but the absence of desire to inflict harm. It's as much mental as it is physical. When applied to politics and the law, it would work like this. Say, for example, a law has been passed that bans gatherings in public. If you want to challenge the law, people would gather in public. This would then force the authorities to use physical force to remove you. Now, when someone uses force against you, what's your natural instinct? Probably to hit back. But, Gandhi said, fighting back would merely legitimize the authorities' use of violence in the first place. But not responding violently makes the difference. Think about it. If people didn't respond with violence when they were hit over the head, how would this make the authorities look? Like bullies. It makes them look oppressive. So by taking the moral high ground and not responding with violence, people could expose the futility of a government's actions and policies. In a way, it proves that all laws, and indeed, in a way, all political systems, have a democratic element within them. Laws require the consent of those to whom they apply, and Gandhi knew this perhaps better than anyone. The other tool that Gandhi used was called satyagraha. This literally means the force of truth, or truth power. It's the idea that the truth behind any political debate or disagreement, be it the British ruling India or the poverty of the rural masses, was the ultimate weapon that favored those who were on the right side of truth. In the British case, the truth was that the British were ruling India without the good of the Indian people in mind, even if they claimed to bring justice, order, and modernity to India. The truth was that Britain was in India for its own selfish reasons. And the moral truth here was the most powerful weapon for Gandhi against the British. Gandhi saw satyagraha itself as a weapon. He didn't advocate passive anything. His moral philosophy was as much a moral tool as it was a political weapon. He actually said that, quote, satyagraha is a sword which spills no blood. So he clearly held to an idea of attacking the British, but not in the way we normally think of confronting political authority. He once noted that it isn't only generals who can lead campaigns. And part of this was practical. Gandhi was not a complete pacifist. He claimed actually that if India had the sword, she should use it. Gandhi once declared, quote, "Where there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence. I would rather have India resort to arms in order to defend her honor than that she should in a cowardly manner become or remain a helpless witness to her own dishonor." But the sheer power and reach of the modern British colonial state was too much for Indians to realistically confront the British on violent terms. Now, it was the combination of these two moral tools that Gandhi saw as the most effective. Combining ahimsa with satyagraha was dynamite, no pun intended. Responding to the Raj and its policies with nonviolence would show the power of truth, satyagraha, that the British rule of India rested on force and the need to humiliate Indians in order to govern them. Wow, what an explosive and sophisticated moral political philosophy. Now, let's examine what forces of modernity Gandhi critiqued and how they influenced his own philosophy. There's a touch of irony in all of this. For many of the forces of modernity that Gandhi critiqued, he had in fact benefited from. But he increasingly became disillusioned with these forces as he experienced more of the contradictions inherent in the British Raj and the British Empire. First was the trend of Anglicization. From Macaulay onwards, it had affected India significantly. Colleges and governments used English. And the early Congress members were loyalist nationalists, and they were Anglicized. They spoke English. But Gandhi didn't want to see Congress replicate the British Raj. He noted that if Congress merely supplanted their British rulers and kept their institutions and everything from Macaulay as hangovers, then Indians would have, as he put it, English rule without the Englishmen. Part of this was his related critique of modern government. Gandhi abhorred modern centralized parliamentary systems, even if they were democratic. Now, India didn't have a parliament, but it was still a modern bureaucracy. It had departments, telegraphs, railways, you name it, everything the British had built up over 200 years. Gandhi was aghast at the power of the colonial state, such as the Rowlatt Acts, the Indian Civil Service, and the vast amounts of information the Raj had accumulated since the late 1700s. But Gandhi was not a fan of democratic systems either. He likened the British Parliament to a prostitute, and the election cycle was its pimp. One day it may be Mr. Lloyd George in charge. The next day it may be Mr. Balfour. And in a vein that is part of modern critiques of democracies today, Gandhi argued that those elected never really care for the people. They only care about staying in power and will say whatever they need in order to remain in power. So what kind of system did Gandhi want? Well, let's say that it was a very anti-modern one. Gandhi thought India's salvation lay in small, self-sustaining village communities that lived off minimalist means, sort of like what the British called village republics. Everything would be local. Gandhi believed that the centralized nation-state, which the British had built up and which Indian nationalists very much wanted to inherit, would sap away from India's civilization and moral character. To Gandhi, it wasn't Indian to have a large, centralized, and powerful state. So the British had brought something antithetical to Indian ways and culture. Gandhi was also a major critic of modern industry, markets, and the global economy. Now this makes sense, given India's brutal exposure to global competition and British industry. He felt that mechanized production took away from the individual worth of labor and opened up the potential for individuals to become dependent on others for their well-being. In a way, he sounded a lot like Karl Marx, except that Gandhi was no atheist. He certainly didn't think in pseudoscientific terms of global proletariats and the means of production. But Gandhi's experience was shaped by what had happened to India. He saw the rural poverty that was made possible by cheaply made factory textiles coming into the country. To Gandhi, the peasant's poverty was linked to the factories of England. Now, all political philosophies use symbols, and the ones that Gandhi chose were significant and telling. Gandhi used the symbols of khadi, or homespun cloth, and the chakra, or the spinning wheel, to underscore his moral and political philosophy. Now, what do these two items symbolize? Well, think back a bit. They were both ways to correct the impoverishment of India. Khadi was a symbol of a time when India used to make its own cloth. Because remember, British cloth had displaced India's ability to make and export their own. It was a powerful symbol. The chakra, on the other hand, was complementary. It symbolized the simple, self-sufficient means by which to make one's own cloth and be proud of it. So who do you think Gandhi meant to appeal to? You got it. The poor countryside and peasants. Gandhi wanted to appeal to the eyes and sentiments of Indian peasants. And as we'll see, this symbolism, combined with jolly good timing, enabled him to energize the countryside and transform the Congress Party into a mass political movement that claimed to speak for the entire nation. Former weavers and peasants forced to grow indigo and other cash crops for British factories were reminded also that at one point they made their own cloth. And this is seen in how Gandhi dressed upon his return to India. He wore the simple dhoti, or loincloth, sandals, and a walking cane. This was to remind the poor masses that their leader not only understood them, but that they were, pardon the pun, cut from the same cloth. And this is also reflected in how Gandhi fashioned his nationalism. Now, what did the British always say about India when nationalists attempted to speak for the nation? They said India was a land divided by caste, class, religion, and region. That it wasn't a nation, the usual divide and rule. In response, Gandhi fashioned a more ecumenical nationalism. He wanted to cut across the very social, economic, and class divides that the British had successfully manipulated for generations. For example, Gandhi urged peasants not to rise up against their fellow Indian zamindar landlords. He thought it was better to forge a common united front against the British, and Gandhi called the British the greatest zamindar of them all. What do you think of Gandhi's political philosophy? Practical? Naive? It's really hard to say. Gandhi's political outlook was tough to measure. In some ways, it was wholly impractical, but in other ways, it was admirable and workable. When asked by an American reporter whether nonviolence would work against Hitler, Gandhi didn't really have an answer that was convincing. But what was more significant was that his ideals gave Indian people hope. And we'll see that was what lifted the spirits of the masses when all else had seemed lost. Gandhi was also, unsurprisingly, a contradictory character and personality. Like any great leader in history, he had flaws. For one, he could be terribly patronizing. He used to run Congress sessions with an almost authoritarian streak, even though he held no official title or position. His attitudes towards women were less than enlightened. We know this because he wrote so much about women's role in Indian society. In one instance, when some village boys taunted a young girl and she complained, Gandhi asked that her hair be cut off for not being shameful enough. He really believed the proper place of women was in the home. He even made his high caste wife attend to the bedpans of visiting guests. Gandhi also rejected the use of contraception because he feared it would drain a nation of its energy. It was almost a sperm economy ideal of the nation. He held an almost Puritan Victorian attitude towards sexual energy and said that sexual energy should only be for procreation and service of the nation. Gandhi also sounded a lot like a Western Orientalist that wanted to imagine India as a timeless rustic land that had never changed. In a way, Gandhi lived in a utopian fantasy. He perpetuated the Orientalist myth of self-sustaining Indian villages who lived in Spartan-like simplicity. The problem was that this is also what the British believed India was and should be. When it came to caste discrimination, his views were equally contradictory. Gandhi preached the emancipation of untouchables, Dalits. But he said this could only be done once low castes and Dalits started washing themselves, adopted vegetarianism, and basically became more Brahmanical, to clean up their act. He also refused to disturb the status quo of the larger caste system, arguing that it provided a model of stability that just needed to be reformed a bit. Yet in spite of these complications and contradictions, Gandhi was the most successful of all Indian nationalists. He prevented alternative and more radical forms of nationalism from leading the way. And Gandhi's moral appeal ultimately led India to independence, or Swaraj. His simple dress and demeanor made him the most unlikely, but also the most dangerous anti-colonial nationalist the British Empire would ever confront. Now let's shift back to the Indian political scene in early 1919. When Gandhi had arrived back to India, it appeared that the constitutional approach to gaining concessions from the British had worked. They had the 1909 reforms to prove it, and the partition of Bengal had been rescinded. The Congress, and many Indians, had been remarkably loyal to the war effort. Yet this all changed in April 1919. In Amritsar, in the Punjab, a spark would fly onto a kerosene-soaked Indian political landscape and light up the country. One April afternoon, British General Reginald Dyer was patrolling the streets of Amritsar. He noticed a theoretically illegal, yet unquestionably peaceful demonstration in the city's public garden, the Jallianwala Bagh. Dyer brought out his Gorkha regiment, and, after being advised to issue another warning to the crowd, decided to fire. It was a massacre. Some 400 were killed, and over 1,000 wounded, women and children included. There was outrage across India, and even within the Raj's administration itself. Dyer, whose actions were made possible by the Rowlatt Acts, which forbade public demonstrations, indicated that it was meant to be a moral signal to India. Now think about it. How might even a loyalist Indian interpret this? Simple injustice. And to those who were loyal to the Raj and to the war effort after 1914, what did this isolated event say about the nature of British rule? Well, it was a symbol of the Raj's exploitation. Amritsar quickly became a symbol of British paternalism and oppression, that the British saw Indians as rowdy schoolchildren who needed to be punished when they were naughty. With shock and anger, Gandhi and the Congress capitalized on this event. Gandhi criticized the Raj's failure to fully repudiate the massacre, which he called, quote, a thinly disguised whitewash. The British forced Dyer to resign, but he was treated to a hero's welcome when he returned to England, with a £30,000 prize from the public. To Gandhi, Dyer was a rotten apple. But he argued that the system from which Dyer came, the Raj, was the orchard, and even it was rotten. And the Rowlatt Acts that made this action legally possible to Gandhi were, in no uncertain terms, he called, quote-unquote, a black act passed by a, quote-unquote, satanic government. This is when the scales started to tip for Congress and for Gandhi. Gandhi saw an opportunity to employ in India the techniques of ahimsa and satyagraha, which he had experimented with in South Africa. And the outrage across India allowed him in Congress to mobilize the masses. This was significant. Gandhi would start a movement that widened the nationalist base of participation against the British. The Congress would change from a gentleman's talk shop about constitutionalism into a populist movement that would force the British to negotiate. Congress would engage the masses, which was, after all, India's real strength, and would call out the British Raj for what it had become, an increasingly autocratic paternalistic regime. Okay, we've looked at Gandhi's background and upbringing and examined Gandhi's moral and political philosophy. We saw how Gandhi critiqued the forces of modernity. And we looked at the 1919 Amritsar massacre, which ensured that Gandhi and his political philosophy were in the right place at the right time. As we've seen, Gandhi was a complicated figure. Yet he offered the most damning critique of the Raj and its policies. This was because Gandhi didn't separate morals from politics, but his moral and political philosophy had the potential to challenge the British, unlike anyone before. So it's in this context that we should see the end of the First World War and the rise of popular nationalism. The British won the war against Germany. But soon after the guns stopped in 1918, they were faced with another kind of threat. This time, that threat was nearly 5,000 miles away and in the very jewel of the crown of their empire.